Hello, welcome to the Technical Advisory Board meeting for the Spring 2020 MARS project. As you know, this is the Measures of Early Mathematical Reasoning Skills project that is funded by the National Science Foundation, and we are in our third year of the project. So we really appreciate your time listening and watching this video and your efforts to provide us with feedback. Today, what we're going to do is we have a few introductions of people. We're going to share the purpose and goals of this meeting, and then we're going to present to you our progress on the learning progressions and really share what we've done so far. And then we're going to share with you information about the teacher advisory panel and next steps. So introductions for the MARS team. You've met many of us before. As you know, I'm Leanne. Returning team members are Josh, Cassandra, Tony, Kadir, and Robin. And you've met many of them or seen many of them, hopefully, when you were here in person or in our meeting in the spring. in September. We do have two new team members who've joined us. One is Jennifer McMurr, and she's on the call with us, and I'll let her introduce herself in a moment. And the other is Aline Mota. So Jennifer, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Leanne. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer McMurr, and as Leanne mentioned, I joined the MARS team a few months ago. My professional and academic background is actually focused in education policy and research methodology, specifically qualitative research and mixed methods research alongside program evaluation. So I spent almost a decade working for a policy center at the George Washington University, and I've also worked for some school districts as well as a private government contracting and consulting firm. For the MARS project specifically, I'm leading our engagement with the teacher advisory panel, and I'm also working on our legislative outreach, and I'm really excited to be working with and learning from you all on the advisory board for the MARS project. So for the purpose of today's presentation is really to share a summative overview of our team's research activities and our process for the MARS project. And since our last TAB meeting in September of 2019, the team really reflected on the advisory panel's input and made some modifications to our research activities that we're going to be covering in today's presentation. So the goal of today's session is really to seek your feedback about the alignment of these research activities and processes to the MARS project goals and outcomes. So you'll see that we have embedded some questions for your consideration within each section of the presentation today. And so what I recommend that you do is probably pause the recording and use the accompanying questions that we've emailed you to jot down your thoughts and responses to our input before moving on to the next topic in the presentation. We'll be collecting your input and reviewing it, and then we'll convene again this fall to continue our discussions about your feedback and our planned activities for the project moving forward. Just as a reminder, before we jump into the meat of the content today, the primary aim of the MARS project is to develop and gather validity evidence for classroom-based assessment systems that measure two constructs: numerical relational reasoning and spatial reasoning. The secondary goals for the project include understanding students' thinking and reasoning around these constructs, as well as supporting teachers' decision-making and informing teachers about the importance of these constructs. So now I'm actually going to pass it back to Leanne to talk a little bit more about the learning progression process.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. We wanted to, as Jennifer mentioned, The purpose of our time together today is to really solicit your feedback on the work that we've done to date on validating or empirically recovering the learning progressions. So we will share with you the data sources and then also an overview of the reconciliation process. We're going to share with you some examples, but we're not going to get into the kind of nitty gritty because we're really actually looking for the high level input about the kind of the sufficiency of the evidence and of the processes and the integrity of the processes that we've used in order to provide validity evidence for the learning progressions. So we do have technical reports that have a lot of the details about the data, which certainly we can share, but by no means are we wanting or thinking that you would be interested in diving that deep into this. But really we're hoping to get some feedback about kind of almost the internal validity of our research projects that we're going to share with you today. So the learning progressions, as you may recall from previous discussions, were really based on a pretty extensive review of the literature, as well as input from experts in a formative process where we designed and iterated on the learning progressions. Once we got to a phase after multiple rounds of internal and external review of those learning progressions, once we got to a stage where we felt that they were a relatively comprehensive explanation of students' thinking in the two constructs, we conducted cognitive interviews and we implemented a teacher survey. We're going to talk briefly about both of those processes and how those data contributed to the learning progressions. So just briefly, to make sure we're all on the same page with learning progressions, I wanted to share with you just the ways in which we are conceptualizing learning progressions. So first, we're identifying the entry knowledge, skills, and abilities. So KSA stands for knowledge, skills, and abilities into the learning progression and specific learning progression. And then we're also identifying the exiting knowledge, skills, and abilities for students. So if you recall, our targeted area, our targeted grade range is kindergarten through second. We know that many students come to kindergarten with knowledge, skills, and abilities in these two early mathematics constructs, and they also continue to develop these beyond second grade. But we're really constraining these between kindergarten and second. But we do also know that there's some subcomponents of the learning progression that may have an earlier end date. So one of the questions that we're looking at, which we'll talk about, is the appropriateness or developmental appropriateness of the entry and exit knowledge, skills, and abilities. So also we know that there's intermediary phases or steps or processes that connect the entry and the exit knowledge, skills, and abilities. And these are kind of the stepping stones or the climbing wall, as Jer, I appreciate your metaphor in that, but really the series of subcomponents that connect the entry skills with the exit skills that define that progression of learning. And there are multiple ways in which there's a hypothesis of how these are connected. It could be a linear sequence, but it could also be not linear for some students. It could be that there's some knowledge, skills, and abilities that are not always needed, and that a depth of knowledge in one could help you compensate for a lack of depth of knowledge in another. And other processes, maybe there's ways of leapfrogging over those. So those are parts of the questions that we're looking at addressing as we examine the learning progressions. So specifically, we were looking for validity evidence around these four aspects of the learning progression. So first, the developmental appropriateness, and we're really trying to define that as the entry and exit skills. The ordering of those subcomponents or the intermediary phases, and whether or not that ordering, the hypothesized ordering, actually aligns with students' thinking. The conception, so what defines any one of those specific circles in the diagram, but the conceptions or the intermediary phases, what is the depth of understanding that defines that? And then how are those interconnected, not just with themselves, but also across core concepts within the same learning progression or across learning progressions in general. So that's kind of the framing of where we've spent the last couple of years in understanding and developing learning progressions that really display and align with the nature of knowing in the domain. So as we come to our specific project, I'm going to share with you the research questions by each one of those 4 components, and then also the data sources. So I will be talking about the first 2 of these components, so developmental appropriateness and ordering, and the research questions and the data sources. And then Cassandra will be talking about the conceptions and the interconnectedness and the qualitative data from the cognitive interviews in those sections. So just to break it up a little bit. So for developmental appropriateness, some of the specific research questions that we were asking are, do the entry and exit KSAs, or knowledge, skills, and abilities, align with teachers' expectations of the prerequisite and target skills? And so the teacher survey data is aligned with that. Do teachers' frequency of teaching the knowledge, skills, and ability align with the progression? So again, looking at the teacher survey. And then, does student performance and engagement indicate floor or ceiling effects that align with the entry or the exit knowledge, skills, and abilities? And we have some scoring data from the cognitive interview tasks, as well as rater observations or observer ratings of the students' comfort with the task, as well as any specific manipulatives in which the students were engaging with the task. So those were the research questions and the data sources specifically associated with developmental appropriateness. For ordering, the research questions that we were considering were, are teachers' perceptions of the appropriateness aligned with the hypothesized order? Do students demonstrate increasingly sophisticated reasoning aligned with the hypothesized ordering of the subcomponents or the intermediary phases? And do students appear comfortable with the tasks and the task elements? And so that is coming from data from the observers' rating of students' comfort. So those are the research questions that I'm going to talk through in the next few slides. And then we'll pause and we'll solicit your feedback. And then Cassandra is going to talk through the research questions and data sources for the conceptions and the interconnectedness. Okay, so I will review the teacher survey data and analyses. And again, many of the details of the methods and the analyses are in our technical reports. And so we didn't want this to be a complete description and discussion of the methods, but we wanted to provide you with a high-level overview so that, again, you could help us think through if the approaches we've used will lead us to high-quality data that will help us draw conclusions. So we administered teacher surveys separately for numeric relational reasoning and spatial reasoning. And for each subcomponent or intermediary phase, teachers responded to questions on a 4-point Likert scale that included aspects about the time that they spend teaching each of the subcomponents, when during the year they teach the subcomponent, the importance of the subcomponent as a prerequisite skill to their specific grade, as well as a focal or target skill to their specific grade, and the developmental appropriateness of the subcomponent by grade. So we did, as you can see, this is broken out by grade in a number of these questions. So we did ask teachers to report their grade, and we had roughly 100 teachers respond across the surveys for each one of the core concepts in the learning progression, and those were broken out, of course, by grade. So just briefly to go through some of the ways in which we examined these data. So I'll explain the diagram on the right in a minute, but data were analyzed to address the research questions that were associated with developmental appropriateness and ordering that specifically relate to this teacher survey data. If we found the modal value provided contrary evidence, then the subcomponent was flagged for further review. So I'll give you an example. So for one of the subcomponents in NRR, that is about comparing two quantities to find which is more or less using mental images, the modal value indicated that kindergarten teachers did not perceive of this as an important subcomponent. Did not perceive this subcomponent as an important prerequisite skill for kindergarten. But the teachers in grades 1 and 2 did perceive of this as important as a prerequisite skill. And so then the teachers in grades K through 2 also perceived of it as important as a focal skill and developmentally appropriate. So in that case, we used those data to indicate that there was alignment with the hypothesized placement of this skill in kindergarten, but we had this skill ending in around middle of first grade. And since the grade 2 teachers perceived of this as being important as a focal skill and developmentally appropriate, this contributes to evidence about considering whether or not that exit knowledge, skills, and ability should not end at the middle of first grade, but instead should perhaps extend into grade 2. So we didn't make any decisions based on one source of data, but that's how we contributed, and we kind of brought those sources of data together in order to reconcile the multiple data sources with the learning progression. So I will turn to the bubble charts, and this one in particular is showing on the x-axis the teacher's perception of the importance as a focal skill, and on the y-axis it is showing the developmental appropriateness of this this specific skill. And this one, as I mentioned before, is comparing two quantities to find which is more or less using mental images. And so you can see that the scale, or maybe you can't see, but I'll explain it to you. Scale goes from, we did have to transform the scale, so it goes from 0 to 3 here, still a 4-point scale, and 0 to 3 on the X and Y axes. And you can see that for kindergarten first and second, which is kindergarten is the first graph, and then first is the middle, and then second grade is the last one on your right. And the way in which the majority of the teachers perceived of both the importance as a focal skill, as well as the developmental appropriateness of this skill. So you can see in kindergarten that we have 5 out of the teachers thought that this was on the upper end of both being important as a focal skill as well as developmentally appropriate. But then as we move to second grade, we'll see that a predominantly high number of teachers, 13 teachers, included or said that this was important as a focal skill as well as developmentally appropriate. So as I mentioned, we had this specific skill or subcomponent ending in first grade. And so these data cause us to rethink whether or not that's appropriate to end in first grade, and whether or not it's something that continues to develop and extend into second grade. So we did not make a decision based solely on these data, but this is something that we used in our reconciliation process. So this is how we processed through the teacher survey data in order to better understand teachers' perceptions of when these skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities start and when they end. So the developmental appropriateness of them as prerequisite skills, as well as focal skills, and then also looking at, and I'll get to this a little bit later, but when teachers teach these different topics and the time that they spend teaching those. So that is the information from the teacher survey, and I will share with you the reconciliation table in a few slides. Moving on now to the cognitive interview quantitative data analyses. Cassandra's going to talk through the qualitative data analyses for the cognitive interviews, but we did also conduct some quantitative data analyses. So the cognitive interviews, as we've talked with you about before, were administered separately to students for both numeric relational reasoning and spatial reasoning. Students responded to both content questions and reasoning questions for each subcomponent. So reasoning questions included things like, can you show me what you're doing in your head? Can you tell me why you answered that way? Can you tell me more about this? Can you show me another way, or can you show me how you did that? And really, we were trying to elicit a lot more about their reasoning behind their actions. It is important to note that all students in kindergarten through second grade, they responded to all of the questions. So even if it was hypothesized that a kindergartner was not, it was not developmentally appropriate to assess a kindergartner on a specific subcomponent, we assessed them anyways, because that was the hypothesis and we wanted to test that hypothesis. Similarly, as we just mentioned with that subcomponent about comparing two quantities using mental images, we assessed second graders on that as well, because it was, even though we originally hypothesized that it should end or that students develop proficiency and it moves on to another dimension at the end of first grade, we wanted to test that hypothesis. So all students responded to all of the numeric relational reasoning and the spatial reasoning cognitive interview questions within their core concept. Okay, so as part of the quantitative data analyses, students' responses were scored for correct and aligned to the learning progression. So just taking a minute to explain what that means. So the learning progression specifies in some instances a way in which students are engaging with the content. And so they may get it correct, but unless they are engaging with the content in a specific way, it might not be correct and aligned. So for example, there's some subcomponents that reference a number line. If a student is not able to demonstrate their understanding on the number line, they may have gotten the item correct, but they did not use the number line, so they would not have scored correct and aligned in that case. So that's just one example. But it is, again, important to note that some students may have actually gotten it correct, but they didn't do the, even with prompting, didn't engage in the way that we anticipated. So we did calculate for some of the quantitative data analyses, we calculated the empirical p-values. However, there is challenge with that because, again, all students across grades K through 2 took those items. So the p-value is the proportion of students scoring correctly. So that may not be necessarily as valuable as other data. And then we also calculated the C proportions, which we call C prop. And what C proportions are is the proportions of students who incorrectly responded to the hypothesized less difficult subcomponent, but correctly answered the hypothesized more difficult subcomponent. So let's take this as an example. So I'm sharing with you one of the core concepts within the numeric relational reasoning learning progression. So each one of these, so A.1, point A is a subcomponent. So these are the bubbles going across. So what C prop is or calculates is the proportion of students who got A1A incorrect, but got A1B correct. So this is indicating that if it does progress in order, or we use these data to help us address this question, is that if it does progress in order from least complex or least difficult to most complex, again, we're trying to disentangle difficulty from complexity, but there's some challenges with that. But if we think about this as moving from less complex to most, the students in this case who got A1A incorrect, we would hypothesize that there would be a small proportion who then got A1B correct, because this would say that they got a less difficult subcomponent correct than a more difficult subcomponent. So similarly, if we continue across with A1A, so A1A, students who got A1A incorrect, about 47%, 46.7%, got A1C correct. And then A1A incorrect, 26.7% got A1D correct. And you can kind of follow this along. So what we would hypothesize to see is that these values would be low, approaching, in some of these cases, approaching 0 or very small values. This would point us to some questions about the ordering of A1A in relation to A1B and A1C. Again, we didn't use any specific data source, any one data source to make changes to the learning progression, but this contributed and continued to add to our validity evidence about the sufficiency of, or I guess I should say, the accuracy of the hypothesized learning progression with students' actual performance. So that gives you a sense of how we analyzed the cognitive interview data quantitatively. There was also one other component during the cognitive interviews that we used to better understand students' engagement. And this was where we had our observers in the cognitive interviews were trained to use a rating scale or a rubric that asked them to evaluate whether or not, they were just really listening for whether or not the interviewer reworded the question or repeated the question. So these were both dichotomous. So just yes, it was reworded, or no, it was not reworded. And then also whether or not the student was comfortable with the manipulatives that were used. And we had, based on our tryouts of the cognitive interview, we had spent time thinking through what that might look like, comments or things that students might indicate that would show that they were comfortable or were not comfortable with those manipulatives. And then we had the observers give an overall rating of the degree of comfort that students demonstrated with the task. Now, part of this was, the reason for this was really to help us think about whether or not there was any engagement um, in indications of engagement that might point to those kind of floor or ceiling effects. So if students with the number line, for example, appeared really uncomfortable with the number line, or didn't were not able to really engage with it, that might give us some indication that this was not necessarily developmentally appropriate for those students. So that's how we were interpreting these data. So we set some cut scores based on what we were observing, in that if greater than 50% of the students needed an item reworded or repeated, or fewer than 75% were comfortable with the manipulatives, we looked at that item much more carefully, and for two reasons. One is to see if the item may have caused some possible confusion. And if the item caused possible confusion, then that's something that we wanted to think about in the way that we interpreted the data that we obtained from that item. So if the item itself was causing students to not really understand what was being asked of them, then that puts into question whether or not the data from that item could be trustworthy for really confirming or disconfirming or contributing evidence in general to the learning progression. So we use that in one case to kind of indicate confusion, but then also in the other to identify skills, or to, again, contribute a piece of information about the out of range items for students. And then also if the overall, the average of the overall comfort score indicated discomfort, so it was on a 4-point scale, if it was, if the average was below 3, then that item was also flagged. So that's a brief summary of the data sources that we used to evaluate, or the quantitative data sources, I should say, that we used to consider the learning progressions and the way in which we hypothesized those. So now I'm going to share with you our process for reconciling for both the developmental appropriateness and ordering. So again, I'm just giving you an example. I'm not going to ask that you spend much time looking at this specifically, but this is for one of our core concepts within one of the learning progressions in numeric relational reasoning. And I'm just showing you this because this specific example, there are 4 subcomponents. They range from kindergarten through 2nd grade with different starts and stops, or entry and exits. And there is a staggered order here that you can see. So this is, I just wanted to share that with you to show you how we then put this information into a table. So this is the summary table that we used. I'm going to walk you through it a little bit, but really, again, what we're mostly looking for is your thoughts and opinions about the research methods and the design and the analyses and the approaches that we're using to gather evidence and validity evidence about the learning progression, not necessarily the outcomes of the this reconciliation process. And as as we've talked about before, this is very important feedback for us, but also very important feedback for NSF to make sure that we're doing good science. So let me walk you through this, and then we'll pause, and you can pause and answer some questions for us. So this one, as I mentioned, is for the core concept around equal sign. And these are the 4 core concepts, so A, B, C, and D. And I'm not going to necessarily read through them. The p-value had them in the order where A was the least difficult, but B was the most difficult. and C was third, and D was second. So we did talk a little bit about some of the issues with the p-values, and that all students were not necessarily, the core concepts, or the subcomponents were not necessarily appropriate for all students. So there are some challenges with the p-value, but then we did analyze the C-prop, and the ordering suggested that it aligned with the original ordering. So A was first, B was second, C was third, and D was fourth. And then this section, which is called the fidelity issues, this is around that rater observations of whether or not the items needed to be reworded, repeated, or if the students were not comfortable with the manipulatives or with the task. So you can see that for A, there's no check marks. So there was, it did not meet our thresholds for repeated, reworded, or discomfort. Not for B, but it did for C. So reached one of the thresholds, and that students were not as comfortable with the task overall, and then, but not for D. For the teacher survey, so this is not developmentally appropriate. So kindergarten teachers, and as I mentioned, we use the modal value, did not perceive that B, C, or D were developmentally appropriate for kindergarten, but the only one that first grade teachers thought was not developmentally appropriate was D. And there are no teachers who, second grade teachers, who perceived of that as being developmentally inappropriate or not being developmentally appropriate. Not important as a focal skill. You can see where that falls, kindergarten all the way across, and then second grade for C and D, and first grade just for D. Not important as a prerequisite skill, kindergarten all the way across for B, C, and D, and then first for C and D, and second for C. These bubble charts are, as we talked about before, important as a focal skill is on the x-axis, and developmentally appropriate is on the y-axis. And you can see that in thinking about the slide that we just shared, this one, some of these that were like D, that was hypothesized to be more in the grade 1 and grade 2, that there might be some areas here where we're seeing that that might not be as developmentally appropriate or important in some instances. So in first grade for D, it looks like the majority of teachers, it's on the lower end for grade 1. And then this is the next part of that. So this, again, remember we talked about the teachers also said whether or not these were taught or not, and when they were taught. So this is the number of teachers and if it's taught or not. So 1 out of 19 kindergarten teachers said A was not taught. 4 out of 19 kindergarten teachers said B was not taught. 13 out of 19 kindergarten teachers said C was not taught, and 14 out of 19 teachers said that D was not taught. So you can see how we looked at these across the grades. And then this is the bubble chart that has the time, so the frequency and of being taught and developmental appropriateness. So again, the first one is kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and it continues for each of these. And then the modal value of when the teachers teach this. So it confirms in some instances another data source where we ask them in a slightly different way of when these are taught, but you can see that there's some variability here. So the way that we used these data were to, again, refer back to the hypothesized learning progression and analyze each one of these data sources to try to make some updates to that learning progression. So again, we're not going to go through all of the finalized learning progressions right now. I will say that we are still in the process of finalizing the learning progressions, but we're most interested in your feedback about the sufficiency of these data sources for allowing us to make conclusions about the developmental appropriateness and ordering of the learning progressions. So this question is asking you to please rate your level of agreement with the statement that the reconciliation process with the teacher survey data will allow us to make conclusions about the developmental appropriateness and ordering of the learning progressions. And if you have some questions or some doubts, or you disagree or strongly disagree, we would really value your input about the teacher survey data and how that could be improved to draw conclusions about the developmental appropriateness and ordering of the learning progressions. And then also, we are seeking your input on the quantitative cognitive interview data. So again, please rate your level of agreement with the following statement that says that the reconciliation process for the quantitative cognitive interview data will allow us to make conclusions about the developmental appropriateness and ordering the learning progressions. And if you disagree or you strongly disagree, we would again really value your input on how we could improve on our process of analyzing those data to draw conclusions about the developmental appropriateness and ordering of the learning progressions. So we would recommend that you pause your video here and take a few moments to complete the survey and share your feedback with us. Again, we'll be using this feedback for our annual report with NSF. And then also we will be using this feedback to help us improve on the science that we're doing.
Okay, so next up, we are going to look deeper at the conceptions related to the students responding on the cognitive interview. And our research questions for this are, do students demonstrate reasoning that is consistent with the hypothesized conceptions? And what misconceptions and/or errors do student makes? And is there a pattern that leads to greater competence? Additionally, we'll talk about interconnectedness, where we also use the student responses on the cognitive interviews to identify what ways the students' KSAs were interconnected and in what ways does prior have an impact on students' responses. So to start off, looking at the qualitative data for the learning progression reconciliation process, we started with data preparation. So we initially had the transcripts done by rev.com, and then we did a verification on those, and then we inserted nonverbal actions and gestures so that coders could better understand students' reasoning and facilitate their ability to analyze the data. Our rationale for this is that we wanted to have a more holistic view of the students' verbal and nonverbal reactions to the questions without having to go back to the video, so that we could, when at all possible, use the transcripts as our source of evidence. During that process, a group of internal and external team members watched the videos and inserted the student actions and gestures while also cleaning the non-mathematical talk turns from the file. Gestures were included as a way of adding meaning to students' responses. We oftentimes found that students' nonverbal responses and their gesturing that they did indicated a level of reasoning that they were doing that they just couldn't verbalize. So during this process, we also verified 20% of all the nonverbal transcriptions that were randomly selected for accuracy and verification for drift. Once those nonverbal transcriptions were complete, then we moved on to the pre-coding stage. In the pre-coding stage, for each subcomponent, we marked in vivo the subcomponent, which you see here on the screen, SRA1A, is the spatial reasoning subcomponent numbering system. And then within that, after the subcomponent was labeled, the coders also used the protocols from the cognitive interviews and labeled and coded the content question and response and the reasoning question and response. And our purpose for this was to allow us to further dig into the content answers and further identify things that we might see within students' initial responses. But then as we're looking at numeric relational reasoning and spatial reasoning, we really wanted to dig into, when we ask those reasoning questions, how did students respond and what additional evidence can we use from that information? After placing the data into these content and reasoning question nodes, we did attempt to establish a deductive coding structure. However, after reviewing our research questions and further consulting with a qualitative expert, we determined that open coding would be the preferred method to analyze this rich data. So we next, for the data analysis portion, we first further trimmed the data using a priori coding. And in this process, we coded the transcripts to mathematical reasoning, tangential, and no reasoning. So within the reasoning question and response, mathematical reasoning was any response that students gave that indicated a connection to math. Now remember, this is verbal and nonverbal responses. Then we had some students that went off on tangents that were completely unrelated to the item, and we wanted to capture how often that happened and see if there was a theme that occurred in those. And so we put those into a separate node. And then we had students that had no reasoning when asked the reasoning question or response. And those are students that shrugged their shoulders and said, I don't know, or were completely nonverbal and non-gestural to the response. We wanted to identify how many times that occurred and see if we found themes within an item as we relate to the other sources of data. So doing this a priori coding not only helped us trim the data, it also helped us gather some quantitative data about how many students were having mathematical reasoning versus how many had tangential and how many had no reasoning. After that, we were really able to dig into the heart of the data. A lead and secondary coder then engaged in the iterative process of open coding. And during open coding, both the lead and secondary coder would open code the data looking for themes. And then they would have, after they developed those preliminary codes, they would cross-reference in debrief meetings and reconcile and compare the codes and finalize the code names and the definitions that occurred. And this was at that subcomponent level. So for SRA1A, we looked into the reasoning question and response. Then we went into the mathematical reasoning within that one subcomponent, and we identified the themes that occurred and then reconciled between the two coders. The two-person coding team really worked collaboratively to complete the open coding by focusing on identification of patterns in student reasoning that would support deepening our understanding of the conceptualization. And simultaneously, we were also able to identify misconceptions and errors that students had. So following the identification of the themes for each subcomponent, we synthesized our themes into axial coding of those themes. And we did this by using a spreadsheet. But before we use that spreadsheet, what we did is we started with, for each core concept that Leanne showed you earlier, there was a list and you could see the progression of the 4 skills. For each of those, we took that subcomponent description along with some other information that we call the elements that vary and our open themes, our open coding themes, and we pulled that together and created a synthesized subcomponent that really identified kind of what we already had, pulling in the new themes that we found, and we were able to synthesize that into one statement. And I'm going to give you an example of that in just a second. So during that synthesizing process, we developed the axial codes, we summarized the themes by strategies, and if we felt like we had a justification for some ordering, we did go ahead and include that justification as part of our rationale, but it was not our intent in this process to finalize the conceptualization. It was more to state the facts and the synthesis that we had come up with. So next I'm going to show you an example of what we did. So here on the screen, you will see here in this column, this is the original subcomponent statement that came from our document that you saw the long lines on. And for SRA1A, which is the code here, we created a title for it. And then in this column, we just documented what we had already had in our original conceptualization. And so we have that our first conceptualization was that students would sort 2- and 3-dimensional shapes regardless of size, orientation, and dimensionality. You'll see in brackets there that we said that that was potentially going to be from kinder foundational to kinder bridging. And then the elements that varied were when we were introducing the different types of shapes in this particular instance. The elements that vary could be different depending on which subcomponent we have, but for this particular instance, it was the shapes that we felt like should be introduced at different target points based on the literature review. So next we inserted the themes that we found. So you'll see here that we found 5 themes when we looked at the data for the subcomponent. We found students that matched shapes without naming them to create groups. And they said things like, it looked like that one. This was the same as the other. We had students that identified the two-dimensional shapes by using formal or informal shape names to define their groups. They might have said diamond or rhombus, but the key here was that they were using a name to explain their grouping. We did have students that applied a 2D shape to a 3D solid. So they might have categorized 3D solids with 2D shapes, but applied the name of the face of the 2D shape. So for example, they called a triangular prism a triangle due to that one shape of the face. Then we saw students that recognized dimensionality, students that explicitly attended to 2-dimensional versus 3-dimensional as a basis for their sorting. And then finally, another theme that we found in the data was that students compared mathematical or non-mathematical visible attributes. So they compared the color or the size of the shapes. They grouped them together based on things like big, little, it was in the middle. And all students with that one use size at least in one theme. So these are the themes that we found. We did not order these. This was just getting them in here. And then what we did is one of our doctoral students took some time to think about how does my original subcomponent here and my themes allow me to further define the conceptualization of this subcomponent. So she spent some time thinking about that, and she indicated where she felt the ordering might be, in that you see ones here and you see twos. And so she has that first students sort the shapes as 2-dimensional versus 3-dimensional. Then students sort 2-dimensional shapes into groups by matching the shape or others. And then students are able to sort similar 2- and 3-dimensional shapes regardless of size, orientation, and dimensionality. You'll notice that that last statement is actually over here on the left, finding that we felt like there were more conceptualizations that could really support teachers or us understanding this at a deeper level. However, because there were 2 coders initially with the themes, we wanted to bring the 2 coders back together. So the 2 coders came back together, and they again talked through the perception initially of what one person came through, and then the perception of the other coder, and they refined that original or this first revision that was made. And in this step, we also ensured that we went back to the themes and identified which themes we were summarizing in the actual coding together. So for example, you'll see now the student sorts 2-dimensional shapes into groups by matching a shape to one or more others with the same or similar attributes. And we defined that as A, which was matching shapes, and E, which is comparing mathematical or non-mathematical visual attributes. Then we looked in and found that students would sort based on the original statement. And then finally, in the end, was 2-dimensional versus 3-dimensional. At times, when we looked at this, we would also look at the other subcomponents that fell after this to use that as our recommendation. Again, we're not necessarily at this point saying this is the absolute order. This is just based on the data that we found in our themes. In all of our themes, we did document by grade, how many kinder students, how many first grade, and how many second grade students that theme showed up for. So that is how we kind of fleshed out the conceptualization of the subcomponents. When we did this, we also wrote down additional questions that we have for consultants and our rationale of how we conceptualized what we were doing. So you'll see that our rationale here was in the correctness data. We looked at all 3 of these statements. The qualitative data showed that 1 second grader was able to distinguish between 2D and 3D. And so that's partially where the rationale to move this to the last came from, but obviously just one student being able to do it is not the final end all be all, but we did feel like there was some rationale there for the decisions. Next, we also identified misconceptions or errors that we found that students did during the coding process. And so you'll see that for each IIA, and IIB, misconceptions and errors have been identified that are related to those statements for this subcomponent. This process was completed across all of each subcomponent across both the SR construct and the NRR construct. And now I'm going to switch back. So to wrap up the part on conceptualization, you'll see that we took the subcomponent that was originally written, the original elements that vary, and our open coding themes, and that led us to make a synthesized subcomponent, again through reconciliation of that data and also another conversation between coders to ensure that we were in agreement as we move forward into the final version of what we'd like to consult with the consultants about. Next up, I'm going to talk about the evidence of interconnectedness. So this is an example of the evidence we found in interconnectedness. We knew as we went in with the open coding theme that we were going to find lots of things in the data. And this recognition of interconnectedness occurred organically as we were working on conceptualization. And so this is an example from SR3B, where students were asked to compose a two-dimensional composite figure using transformations. And so you can see, I like to say the picture on the right side looks like a rocket ship, perhaps. Students were using pattern blocks to create the shape, given some different pattern blocks, and you'll see 3 varying levels of students' answers to that puzzle. And as we were analyzing the transcripts, we saw evidence of the SRA2s, which is where students can recognize a translation, rotation, and reflection. So we saw students using those transformations, and oftentimes we saw a connection back to the 2s in that they were not only recognizing them, they were utilizing them, which I'm wondering if the interconnections there relate. And then we also found interconnections that some students, as they were describing their reasoning and what they did, they would use the shape names as a part of their description. So organically, we saw these connections to interconnectedness. And so we're analyzing the data for interconnections in addition to the conceptualizations. So in summary, you'll see that our qualitative analysis of the student responses has evidence that we are further refining the conceptualization and the interconnections hypothesized in the original learning progression. So at this point, we'd like to ask you to please rate your level of agreement with the following statement. The reconciliation process for the qualitative cognitive interview data will allow Mars researchers to make conclusions about the conceptualization and interconnectedness of the learning progressions. And again, if you disagree, strongly disagree, or have some strong opinions you'd like to share, please explain how the process could be improved upon to draw these conclusions. And we would really value your feedback as we move forward and think forward to our next steps of the project. So far we've talked about the qualitative data sources of evidence and what we've done to bring that to the stage of reconciliation, and also the quantitative. And so next up is we are going to integrate the 2 together, where we will meet with our original panel of experts who contributed to the development of the initial learning progressions, and integrate these 2 sources of data together and get their feedback and help refine the learning progressions. So knowing what you know about the quantitative work that we did and those reconciliation tables that Leanne shared, and the qualitative work that we've done in that kind of spreadsheet format that I shared on the conceptualization and what I talked about on the interconnections, we're wondering, we would like for you to rate the integration of qualitative and quantitative data and how that will provide meaningful evidence for Mars researchers to be able to draw conclusions about the validity of the learning progressions. And then again, if you disagree or strongly agree, please explain that process. So at this point, we recommend that you pause the video and go dig into your document and provide us some feedback so that we can use that as we move forward.
I pause the recording.
I paused.
Welcome back. We thought for this last section of the presentation today that we would spend a little bit of time talking about our planned engagements with the teacher advisory panel. So last September, you all suggested soliciting feedback from teachers who do not use the workshop or stations instructional model. And we have two returning teachers on the teacher advisory panel. And we are currently recruiting new teachers for the teacher advisory panel. And based on you all's suggestion, we are asking our new panelists and our returning panelists about their instructional models, just to ensure that we have a mix of practices that are represented within our teacher advisory panel. We are continuing with the human-centered design approach to really look at the usability and usefulness of the classroom-based math assessments. And as a reminder, the human-centered design approach really puts the user, in our case the teacher, and their needs at the center of the design approach. And it's an iterative process, if you remember, but we are continuing our progress both around and through those rings here that are shown on this figure. We are planning 2 meeting sessions with the teacher advisory panel next month in July. And for our first meeting session, we are going to be introducing the learning progressions to the TAP. And we will be conducting focus groups to really understand what questions the teachers have about learning progressions, how teachers envision using learning progressions, and what teachers think about the learning progressions and their usefulness to inform instructional practice with their students. During the second meeting session, we're going to be building on some of these findings from the first session, as well as the prior TAP findings, to really try to better understand how the TAP would like to use the assessments and the corresponding learning progressions in their classrooms. As you might remember, we learned from earlier engagement with our teacher advisory panel that these teachers would really like to use the MARS assessments for instructional grouping, as well as to communicate with parents. And so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into these areas through storyboarding and some other human-centered design activities that we have planned for the second session. So based on this high-level overview of our plans to re-engage with the teacher advisory panel, now is a good point to pause again and reflect just a little bit on what we've shared with you, and for you all to rate your level of agreement with this statement here on the screen. The process for engagement that we described with our teacher advisory panel will allow the MARS researchers to share the importance of the learning progression constructs and further develop the use case for the assessments with teachers. And again, if you have selected disagree or strongly disagree, to please provide us some additional input on how our process might be improved. As a reminder, please reference back to the questions in the Word document that was attached to the email, and email the comprehensive Word document with your responses back to Tony by July 17th. Many thanks for your time today. We really value your expertise, and we look forward to reviewing your feedback.
Yes, thank you very much. It is sad that we couldn't meet in person, but I hope that you are all safe and healthy. And again, we sincerely appreciate your input and your feedback. And we hope that we can see you again in person soon. We will connect again for formative feedback in the fall. And then hopefully we'll have a chance to meet in person sometime in the coming year. But we want to make sure that we do that under the safest conditions for you all as possible. So thank you again. Enjoy your summer, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.